welcome everyone. I'm hoping you can all hear me. It is 7 o'clock, so we will kick off. I'd just like to say a very warm welcome to our webinar. It's hosted by Denji and NAF in association with the Redpost Equestrian. And we have a very special guest speaker, Jamie Gibbs from Stringer Equine Vets as well. My name is Katie Williams, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of all of us when I say we're delighted to be able to run this webinar. We would obviously all prefer to be with you in person, but as that isn't possible at the moment, we're determined to sort of make the best of the situation. And I think we have a great selection of speakers and topics for you this evening. I'm also going to put our cards straight on the table. On behalf of certainly myself and the speakers, please bear with us. We're trying to tame the technology and learning as we go along with Zoom. We will do our best to make things run as smoothly as possible. But do bear with us and cut us some slack, as they say, if we have a few internet challenges. We are recording the presentation, so if anyone misses any part of it or needs to leave early or something like that, then it will be available to all attendees afterwards. And I do have some audience participation polls, so if I manage to make the technology work, we'd really appreciate your input as we go along. Just a couple of important details about this evening. We're going to run all the presentations without questions initially, and then if you want to send in the chat box your questions, we will answer them all in a sort of panel session at the end. And then again, it means if anyone does need to leave early, they do actually get to see all the presentations first. As I'm sure you're aware, this event is run in conjunction with Redpost Equestrian, who are based near Totnes in Devon. And as this event has actually been posted on social media, I think we've got people joining us from much further afield. But if you are lucky enough to live in the beautiful county of Devon, you can collect a goodie bag next time you visit Redpost Equestrian. They will be available from Thursday the 5th of November. And all you have to do is quote your name at the counter and let people know there that you attended the webinar. In addition, Redpost are actually offering triple points on Denji products until the 14th of November, and there's then a range of offers on selected products running to the end of the year. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jamie Gibbs, who I'm sure many of you will know much better than me, as he's a local chap. He's been at Stringer Vets since early 2011, and after spending 2 years down under working on some of the biggest thoroughbred studs, he has returned, and prior to this he had actually worked in mixed practice in Ireland before deciding to specialise in horses. Jamie likes to relax, and it has exclamation mark in brackets after this, by adventure racing. I'm not entirely sure what that involves, Jamie, but maybe you can elaborate. And also playing the guitar and going to folk nights. And I am quite reassured by the fact that he plays the guitar, because if the technology fails later, he can entertain us all while I'm struggling with the technology. But in the meantime, we'll just bear with us and we'll transfer across to Jamie. Right, Jamie, I think I've made you host, so hopefully.
Okay, so I just share my screen. Okay, perfect. Okay, hello all. Thanks for the invitation, Katie and Kate, and for Redpost, as Redpost, for the chance to talk. Tonight I'm going to talk about gastric ulcers. If people who don't know me, I'm a vet obviously from Ireland, but I've been working in Devon for Stringer Equine for probably the last almost 10 years now. I'm just going to get on to the talk because we have limited time, and I know I want to try to keep your concentration for as long as we can. So I'm going to talk about ulcers tonight. Being something just in winter, I thought it was a good topic because we see a lot of it during the winter. Okay, an overview of what I'm going to talk about. So first of all, I'll go through clinical signs, cause of ulcers, pathogenesis meaning, why are they caused, what happens to them. Go through diagnosis, how do we find whether your horse has ulcers or not. And then we go to treatment, and then I'll go through summary just quickly. So, warning signs of ulcers. What are, when do you think your horse will have ulcers? Horse could become aggressive, have a nervous disposition, poor appetite, picky eaters, can be something where your alarm bells might say ulcers. Poor body condition, I just put this in. Some horses with poor body condition might have ulcers, but you have to think some horses that are in good body condition can have ulceration as well. Poor performance, a horse that doesn't want to work, doesn't want to stretch. Sometimes this can be an issue with ulceration. Girthy, well, this, I could have put this number one. This is like the synonymous with ulcers. But some horses, when they just don't like the girth being pulled up, they're bitey. Recurrent mild colic episodes, hindgut ulceration, that can be a thing. I put this picture, as you can see, this horse looks very, very happy. And I think that both rider and horse are not happy, ears back, angry. Okay, also, what else could we have when with ulcers? A reluctance to go forward. On-off lameness issues, meaning the horse necessarily isn't lame, but it doesn't want to stretch, which is kind of important. Constant saddle issues. Horse isn't comfortable with your saddle. You're always having to have your saddle addressed. Bucking when ridden, and just at the end, a sore back. That horse can just have referred pain from its stomach. Obviously, bucking when ridden, this horse is able to pirouette on one leg. Okay, so my exam, someone rings me, a client rings me and says they think their horse has ulcers. What do I do? Do I tell them to starve the animal and bring out my gastroscope? No, first off, I'd like to examine the horse, have a listen to the horse's heart, listen to the lungs, look in the mouth, examine the teeth, examine the back. Is the horse girthy? Maybe do a quick lameness on the horse, flexions, lunging the hard and soft. And also sometimes, you will see the horse, I will see the horse ridden if I have, if you have time, you want to kind of get as much information as I can being of it for these situations. So let's get on to what I'm talking about. So equine gastric ulcer syndrome. This is a common, very, very common, and there's different names for it. This is the name that encompasses the whole syndrome. And it's a serious, like a very, very common condition, but affecting foals and adult horses. Affecting foals because it does affect a lot of foals. And what it's described as is ulceration in the esophagus, stomach, and small intestine. So through the tract, esophagus, stomach, and small intestine of the animal. How common is it? Well, as you can see in this, 50% of foals are affected. That number would be very, very high in weaning. When horses are separated from the mothers, I'd say 90% of those foals are affected. So, and then we go on to 54% of leisure horses, which when you think about it, your horse that you take from your stable and hack out on that isn't in serious competition, 54%, it's a high number. 65% of performance horses. And then we go on to thoroughbreds and racing, 93%. That's a really, really high number. So classification of ulcers. There's two forms. There isn't just that, like the name I said earlier, like that just form, it's a name encompassing, but it's subdivided into ESGD, equine squamous gastric disease, and equine glandular gastric disease. Equine squamous gastric disease affects, if you can see my cursor, top half of the stomach. Lined by squamous epithelium, this area is really to be filled with food and is when the stomach is digesting and isn't usually exposed to acid, gets damaged by acid when there isn't food in the stomach or during exercise. One of the things when acid is splashed up, the epithelium, which is the layer of this, is just a single layer of squamous cells, and it is easily damaged by acid. And then we have equine glandular gastric disease. This is really in the lower half of the stomach. This is the area which produces acid. And so this area shouldn't really be damaged by acid. But this is where the acid, like the digestion goes on. So when this area is damaged, it's due to damage to the protective mechanisms in this area that protect it against the acid, because this area produces acid. And I'll go on. What is the cause of gastric ulcers? So when the cause of gastric ulceration is really an imbalance between the protective and the aggressive. The aggressive, which cause damage, the protective, which help it. So when you've an increase in the aggressive factors, so you've increase in damage by the acid, bile acids and other organic acids. Bile acids are produced by the liver. Gastric acid is produced in the glandular area of the stomach by peptic cells. It's hydrochloric acid, very, very damaging, but food acts to soak that up. And also causes of it is when you've a decrease in the protective factors, saliva, mucus, which is produced in the glandular area, food, when you don't have enough food, and when you've a decrease in blood supply. This is kind of important because when you've a decrease in blood supply, when you have ulcers, you've damage to the lining of the stomach. So you've a decrease in the blood supply to that area. So you get more damage, so you hence more ulceration. So the cause of gastric ulcers, but this isn't the cause of all of them. This is going to talk about the squamous gastric disease first. So the primary cause of squamous disease in the upper half of the stomach is prolonged exposure to acid. It's when acid damages it. There's loads of different reasons. You can see transportation, high-grain diet, stress. Transportation, the animal might not be feeding the whole time, so will not have food in the stomach. Intermittent feeding. Other illnesses, there's lots of illnesses like colic and other things that can cause damage to this area when the horse isn't eating. Inappropriate management is just one to put in if the horse is stressed. Intense exercise. And this is kind of important because when a horse is intensely exercised, the abdominal musculature forces acid into the upper half of the stomach. And so that's why in thoroughbreds, when they are doing intense exercise, they can get acid splashing in their stomach and cause damage. So that's equine squamous disease. For the glandular disease, the risk factors are similar, but it's less clear. It's really due to a decrease in the protection from gastric acid rather than increased exposure. So in glandular disease, you get a damage to the protective lining, reduce in mucus bicarbonate layer, decreased blood flow. These can be caused by stress and intermittent illness. Lack of water is a big contributing factor in glandular disease. Straw feeding is too much straw. You can include straw, but not continuous, not just straw feeding. I put bacteria because in humans, Helicobacter pylori is recognized as a source of infection in glandular in ulcers in humans. But unfortunately, there hasn't been enough papers produced in horses to see how this actually interacts. Anti-inflammatory drugs. Now, this is kind of a very, very hard one because bute is recognized as a substance that too much bute could, if a horse isn't eating, could, potentially, I think, cause ulceration. But it has been proven in studies that 15 days of phenylbutazone or Danilon does not cause ulcers. But I'd still be very, very slow to put like a horse that's not eating on a large amount of bute. There's other risk factors also that can be involved in this. So we go to diagnosis. How do we find that your horse has ulcers? Gastroscopy, so scoping the animal, is the only really definitive way to find out, having a look inside the stomach. It's a well-tolerated procedure. It lasts, a scope can take anything from 10 to 30 minutes, depending on how hard it is to maneuver around. You've got a 3-meter flexible scope with a camera on the top of it. And that's what looks around. So the animal will be starved overnight and usually done, we do it stable side, or sometimes we can do it at a clinic, but usually stable side. So it's a sedated standing horse. And the endoscope is inserted into the nostril, goes to the back of the throat, into the pharynx, swallowed by the horse, and then goes down to the esophagus, into the stomach. And so that way then we can have a look around the stomach and look for ulcers. These are just 2 pictures. On the left is our gastroscope, and on the right is Emer and Catherine, Emer being our vet, and Catherine, who did a scope this morning of Luna, just to see how this is all set up stable side. You can see just here, Catherine has a scope up through the nose, which is going into the stomach, and Emer is just, there's the scope can be moved from side to side, so she's just literally directing the scope and having a look at the image. So this is I'm just going to do a quick video of passage of the scope up through the nose. It's just quick, just to give people an idea. So it goes into the pharynx, and it just comes down, and then you can see there's the pharynx there, and I'll just go to the next one. So this is when you get to the pharynx, what you do. Down in here is the lungs, so we just pass it, horse swallows, and then gets into the esophagus, which is here. You can see the scope there, it's just retroflexed. So this is another, when you get to the stomach, this is really because it just shows the glandular area, but it also shows, this is the marica plicatus, so the junction between the squamous and the glandular. So just quickly just do this there, you can see the glandular area, and then it goes into the soup, this is the acid, and then we come out of that and look at the glandular, but it's more really just to look at this. That's what I wanted to put this, to look at the glandular, that's here, looking at that area. Okay, so squamous disease, how do we grade squamous disease? So it's squamous disease, as I said, affecting the upper half of the stomach. So when scoping, grade 0, which is epithelium is intact and there's no signs of folding or thickening of the epithelium. Then we go to grade 1, which is you see yellow staining, you see folding and thickening of the epithelium through damage, through acid, and we call that hyperkeratosis, where there's more cells being produced to protect the stomach. And then we've got grade 2, where you start seeing focal being small lesions, or multifocal is single, where there's a few lesions being ulcers, and also you see thickening of this epithelium of the stomach. In grade 3, you can see lines, and you can see exudate on them in yellowing. They look angry and sore. You can see erosion into the superficial layers of the stomach. This is grade 3, with this horse would be bloody sore. And this is all on the squamous epithelium. This is the glandular epithelium down here. Grade 4, you can see quite extensive lesions all along there, and they're deep, and they're involving the layers, like not just the superficial layers, right down into the tissue underneath, and these will be bleeding and very, very sore. With glandular disease, it's not. There used to be a grading scheme, but there isn't anymore. So what we do is we grade them on how they look. This is the pilaris. So this is a mild glandular lesion. It's just focal. There's 1, there's 2. Sorry. And this is more severe. You see reddening around here. You see there's fibrinous suppurative. There's almost like little pus areas coming out of that. That's quite angry, diseased in that one. And then this one, I hope you can see this picture. It's in the antrum, so it's in the glandular area. This is severe, single focal, but it's erosive, it's depressed, and it's fibrinosuppurative, so it's producing like a fibrin type, which is a blood substance, and pus, so it's quite angry. Treating ulcers. How do we treat ulcers? It's a combination of 2 things: management and therapeutic measures. What do we want to do? So we want to relieve the pain of the stomach. We want to eliminate the clinical signs. So we want the animal working, we want the animal happy. We want to promote ulcer healing. We want to heal those ulcers. We want to prevent secondary complications. We don't want the horse getting worse. We don't want the horse angry or anything like that. We also reduce the treating ulcers can be quite costly, so we want to reduce the cost of it and duration of treatment. Get the horse into the best shape you can as quickly as you can. And also we want to prevent ulcer recurrence, so we want to make sure that this horse never gets ulcers again. Treatment, management changes. What do we do? So horses are designed to be continuous grazers, not to have empty stomachs. Humans and they've done studies in pigs produce acid in response to food. Horses produce acid continuously. So for horses, an empty stomach is doing damage to the stomach. We also want to decrease stress. I just put this as an example of having companions. If your horse is on its own, they've done studies like in stabling, where if you've got solid partitions between horses, or horses where they can see each other, that the incidence of ulcers is higher in horses that can't see other horses. Regular routine, which is important for horses because they need routine. And also in a horse that's got bad ulceration, it is important sometimes just to reduce the workload. Come backwards in your work. Don't be, if this horse is in high competition, just reduce for a few week or two to let the therapeutic measures, especially like let the drugs work, let them help. So your therapeutic measures, what do we aim to do? We want to suppress acid. We want to reduce the amount of acid in the stomach so it heals, so it's not constantly being aggravated. And there's also, we put in stomach protectants, stuff like sucralfate, which lines the glandular area. And also we want to identify and treat any concurrent illness. This is kind of important because there could be other reasons why your horse has ulcers. So we want to treat reasons, like, if your horse maybe needs worming, maybe it might have other like lameness or back issues that are causing the ulcers. So you need to treat these concurrently and look into them. So our treatment really in all forms of equine gastric ulcer syndrome is to reduce acid. So how do we do that? We do it with omeprazole. Omeprazole, it's recommended and is commonly prescribed for both types of equine gastric ulcer syndrome. It reduces acid production through inhibition of acid producing pumps in the stomach. It's effective and it's given once daily dosing. And you do initial treatment for 28 days. Omeprazole needs to be enterically coated. It needs to be protected from the acid when giving it to a horse. So there's two forms. There's some omeprazole. Omeprazole comes in a microgranule form that's protected, or in Gastrogard, which is commonly used substance. It's got a bicarbonate buffer around it to protect it against the acid. I also put in, after an initial course of 28 days. After initial course of 28 days, we usually scope the horse to see how its stomach looks. But you can continue a course at a quarter of the dose. It's been proven that a quarter of the dose continued on can really prevent recurrence of ulcers in a horse. So we've also got at our disposal injectable omeprazole, which is very, very handy in horses that, horses difficult to worm, that you can't get the worm, that you can't get the oral Gastrogard into, like loads of different forms of it. There is cascade issues in there at the moment. There is a racing ban on it, but it is very, very effective. It works for 7 days, one injection every 7 days. Sucralfate, not licensed in horses, but can be prescribed by your vet. It is it's invaluable, like a drug for horses with especially hindgut and gastric glandular disease. It acts as a protective coating and forms a sticky-like substance that sticks well to ulcerated areas. So in glandular disease, it increases that protective mucus barrier that is damaged, and that's why you have them, why you have the ulcers. It's very, very commonly used in foals for ulcers, very, very commonly. And it's, like, as I said, it's used for a need for glandular disease. I put in antimicrobials. I find sometimes if I scope a horse and it's got grade 4 ulceration and it's got damage to its glandular mucosa as well, I will put the horse on antimicrobials. Some vets don't, but I will put them on trimetazine or sulfa powders just because I think it's, I don't know, is there a link between Helicobacter or not? I don't know, but I find sometimes that it's just an extra thing. I don't do every horse, but I find them very, very bad ulcers. I will. I just put feed additives and supplements. There's loads of different supplements out there. I'm not going to get into these. I think my other two speakers would be much more better able to talk about these than I ever would. But there's many different products available. Some people feed antacids to their horse. Well, antacids are good, but they have a short half-life, so you have to be feeding them 4 or 5 times a day to really help. There is also studies that pectin-lecithin complexes are quite good, and these things can be used after initial treatment has been performed. So what do? We treat for 4 weeks, and then we rescope to see is there an improvement, is there not. If you rescope and you see no improvement, we would maybe change depending on what our regime is. Would we, if we start on oral omeprazole, we might change to the injection. There, just to see is a better uptake. If we start on the injection, we might change to oral. You really want to make sure that the healing is good. So as I said there, we'll continue treatment at a reduced rate. We want to make sure the stomach is as healed as we can. And in this time, as I said before, we will be looking at concurrent reasons why the horse might have ulceration, which is quite important. We might be looking at, does the horse have a bad back? Do we need to x-ray its back? Does the horse have a lameness issue? Do we need to go into that and see what's going on? Does the horse have a sore neck? All these things can contribute to a horse with a sore stomach. And obviously, unfortunately, the treatment of ulcers is quite costly. It can be up to £13 a day. So we want to reduce that. We want to reduce that treatment time by as quick as we can. So how do we prevent a recurrence of ulcers? So management changes. We want to feed like a low sugar chaff. This is kind of important. I recommend this, like have a handful just before work. How this works is this lies on the fluid layer in the stomach. So it just stops the splashing of the acid up into the squamous, up into the top half of the stomach. So then thereby reducing the amount of ulceration during exercise. And it doesn't have to be a huge amount. It's just a small amount can help ulcers. You can also help horses, but you can also give it during traveling periods of stress. And this also, omeprazole therapy, these are horses, this is, really for horses that are really prone to ulceration. You can give it a reduced dose around times that will be stressful for the horse. So if you're going to, if you're traveling your horse to a ride, you're staying away at a camp, giving a reduced dose, even a quarter of the dose for a few days before and during and after will really help the horse. If you're moving yard for a 2-week period, put the horse, a quarter of the dose would really, really help it. Competitions, obviously, would be really, really good. The British Horse Racing Association, there is detection times. It's usually 72 hours at the moment. FEI omeprazole is allowed. I looked that up today just to make sure, but it is allowed. There's no withdrawal period. So in summary, I think I've rattled through this quite quickly, but in summary, ulcers, they're a common condition in all horses. The symptoms can be silent, vague, or severe in some cases. Diagnosis does rely on gastroscopy. It relies on having a look into the stomach. It's kind of very, very important. We have lots of clients who would just rather treat their horse. And I can understand that because it's quite expensive to scope a horse. But the treatment is much more expensive than actually scoping the horse. And sometimes I've scoped horses that have no ulcers. They've got the signs of ulcers, clinical signs of ulceration, but they've got no ulcers. They've got a very, very clean stomach. So by scoping the horse, you're removing the money that you'll spend on treatment, which I think is quite important. Treatment, it requires management and therapeutic changes. It's very, very important. You can't just give your horse omeprazole and carry on the way you were before. You have to think, why does your horse have ulcers? Why is it stressed? Is there something that has changed in its environment? Is there something that you can help it with? Is there something else that we need to do, like a lameness workup or something like that? For horses with ulcers, as I've said, acid suppression therapy is the key factor, reducing the amount of acid produced, but also keeping that stomach with food in it, so you can not leaving your horse for long times without food. Obviously, if you feed your horse a lot of grain, maybe look into that. Is maybe reducing the amount of grain. Also, there's been studies that you shouldn't, with grain, don't feed like less than 6 hours. That's really increases ulceration in the horse. Also, another thing I'd like to say is just about for a treatment for gastric glandular disease, corn oil, vegetable oil has been seen to be very, very beneficial. Also, another thing is don't leave your horse without water. Very, very important. And treatment like all these things put together, omeprazole, sucralfate, management it's very effective and it has a good prognosis. You can get, with treatment alone, you can get this study of 60% improvement in ulceration, but this can go on to 90 and even more with prolonged treatment and changes in management. And this is what you want. You want a horse that's happy to work years forward. And obviously, this is my wife, but it's a nice, happy horse. Okay, thank you for your attention, and I'll hand you back.
Lovely, thank you, Jamie. Right, we'll just have a quick switch across to myself. I'm up next. Ooh. Jamie, I think you might need to just hand back the host if you can. I'm trying to see, I can't get it back from you. I think you've got to stop as host. Can't do it anywhere else. Jamie, can you see the box in the middle with your name on? I think if you right click on there. Oh, you can't see that. If you go down to the participants box and into panelists at the bottom. Maybe I need to come out of that. I am the host now. Lovely, thank you. Brilliant. So I should be able to share screen. Here's mine. Some screen sharing. So if I go from beginning. I'm getting there. Brilliant. And I need to start my camera. Okay, hopefully you should be able to see those slides. So I have the slightly unenviable task of introducing myself, but my name is Katie Williams. I've worked at Denji for just over 17 years now. And I've been working as an equine nutritionist in total for over 20 years, which is a scary thought. Most recently, I embarked on a PhD part-time in veterinary medicine research at the University of Glasgow. But alongside that, or probably more importantly, my full-time role is as technical and product development manager for Denji. So that involves all sorts of things like creating new products, ensuring they are legally compliant, and also being involved with things like beta, working on the fee committee alongside Kate, who you're going to hear from after me. Occasionally I'm let out to provide technical support for some of our key customers. I'm very lucky to work with the Queen Studs at Sandringham and Balmoral, and I think the latter being my absolute favourite customer to visit. But my topic for this evening really is the importance of finding the right forage for each horse in the winter months. So I thought I'd start with a few facts and figures. So some of the diseases that we know challenge horses today would include laminitis, and fairly consistently, the data suggests around 7% of the UK equine population are affected by laminitis. But I think the fear of it is potentially greater than that. So we're going to look at obesity in a minute, which is obviously one of the predisposing factors to laminitis. But the actual number of horses with the disease is around about 7%. Some very old data looking at the concentrate intake in horses, so this would be cereal-based feeds, anywhere between 2.5 to 5 kilos per day. It gives an odds ratio for colic of 4.77 times greater than horses that don't have that level of cereal intake. And as Jamie's just talked about, equine gastric ulcer syndrome has a really high incidence in racehorses, and increasingly we know it's a disease in leisure horses too. All these levels really continue at similar sort of levels or incidences in the populations, and the National Equine Health Survey, which is published every year, suggests that these issues don't go away. And really, as a nutritionist, these are all sort of feed-related issues. We need to try and understand more about what contributes to these problems and why they aren't reducing or declining. And I think part of the problem is that the common factor is obviously they're all associated with the way we feed and manage our horses and ponies. What can we do about it? Well, the starting point is really to try and let your horse eat like a horse. And unfortunately, sometimes we make it incredibly difficult to eat like a horse. And there's lots of reasons for that, and we'll explore some of them as we go through this evening. A couple of years ago, we carried out a survey with horse and hound. We got a reasonably good level of response, about 275 respondents in total. And what was interesting is that people really knew what they were supposed to be doing, so a really high understanding of all the sort of actions they should be taking to reduce the risk of gastric ulcers in particular. So things like feeding more forage, turning out, trying to avoid the stressful situations, and obviously the feeding the double handful of fibre before exercise. But it's apparent we're just not quite so good at actually doing it. And it may be that we want to, but we can't, or it could be that we just don't do it for whatever reason, that you could physically feed a horse before exercise, but something's stopping you from doing it. The red writing is sort of my interpretation of some of this. So certainly increasing access to hay or fibre, only 67% were doing that, despite knowing that their horse or thinking their horse might have ulcers. And it does really raise an issue in good doers. I did a little survey on Twitter a couple of days ago with some of the vets that I follow, and they follow me and things, and vet students. And I asked them what some of their the common objections to people, or the reasons why they couldn't feed hay or what reasons for obesity. And the trouble was that people were more worried about the risk of ulcers than actually the obesity issue. So they were actually feeding lots of forage, rightly so for gastric health, but it was actually contributing to the horses being overweight. So we've got this conundrum as a horse owner. What do? We're encouraged to feed ad lib and feed plenty of fibre, but if that's contributing to our horses' obesity, we're creating a problem for ourselves. And obviously, if you're on the livery yard, it isn't always possible to turn out. So I do have a lot of sympathy, in fact, for people in that scenario, because, the livery might be the best sort of location, and it might have outdoor arenas and floodlights and hacking and all those other reasons why you want to remain there, but they just might not let you turn out more than maybe a couple of hours a day. And, you don't want to move yards, but you have to manage the implications of not being able to turn out. So these are all good practices, even if your horse doesn't have ulcers. I mean, obviously feeding plenty of forage is good for gut health, but there are sometimes things that get in a way of trying to be able to do the best for your horse. The most common problem of all, well, obesity. Basically, studies suggest that 40% of the total population are affected or overweight or obese, and probably over 75% of the leisure horse population. So when you take all the fit race horses and performance horses out of the equation, the incidence comes right up. So it certainly is the issue of our time in most sort of pet species, including the horse. And I have a few sort of pictures and graphics to sort of explain some of the contributing factors to this issue. And I must credit Tamsin Furtado, who is one of the key researchers in this area. She's presented at Beaver Congress and the Beta Conference in the last few years talking about obesity. She's actually very interested in and involved in the research on the sociology side of it. So trying to understand what our problems are as humans in terms of why we don't try to achieve or can't achieve weight loss in our animals. So I think we are literally putting the cart before the horse. So whereas the horse historically would have been pulling the trailer or the carriage. Now we put the horse in it, and that obviously means that they're not doing quite so much work as they might have done historically. Another reason is that they're burning less energy to keep warm because we put lots of rugs on them, and even down here in South East England we come across lots of native ponies that literally have duvets and very thick rugs rugged up, and they're bred and adapted to coping in 6-foot snow on the Scottish Highlands. When I go up to Balmoral and see how the Highland ponies cope on sort of vertical slopes with snow up to their bellies, and they're still good doers, they're still holding weight and verging on obesity, you know how well equipped and how well designed they are for coping with that kind of weather conditions. You bring them down south where we don't see snow anymore, and it's you realise how unnecessary a lot of these rugs actually are. And a really good point that Tamsin makes is actually how we think of exercise versus work. So we might, she used the analogy of dogs and walking them for an hour or so and giving them a good walk, and that they love it and it's exercise. Whereas when we tend to talk about exercising our horses, we term it in using the word work. So we are working them, and it's perhaps therefore less enjoyable. So these are all things, the perception of how we manage our horses, that are contributing to some of these obesity problems. Now, 2020 has given some people more time to ride, for sure. They are going to be potentially using a few more calories, having the time to actually exercise for longer and more regularly, but it still is the biggest problem for the majority of leisure horses. And we're going to talk about how we find the right forage for these animals as we go through. Now, we tend to use the body condition scoring or body fat scoring system from the 0 to 5 scale. There is the other scale, that's decided to move on of its own accord, up to 9, but we find it generally easier to use the 0 to 5. Neither one is right or wrong, it's just what you prefer. And we're trying to change away actually really from the term condition to fat, because it actually then starts to make it more about managing obesity and not talking about general condition. But if we have a look at some images of some horses, so this is a condition score, or fat score 3, which would be moderate, and we try and avoid the term ideal or perfect or correct in the middle, because a condition score 3, just because it's in the middle of the scale, doesn't always mean to say that it's the right one for that horse. So if you had something that was prone to laminitis, or obviously a fit performance horse, it might be a 2.5, and a racehorse might even be as low as 2 type of thing, because that's appropriate for the work it's doing. But in this scenario, we use the phrase or the term moderate for something that's a condition score 3. At the top end of the spectrum, we have a condition score 5, which we would classify as obese. And I think you can all see from this Exmoor pony the cresty neck and the very round sort of bottom, and basically there is not a rib visible. But when you're on a yard as a nutritionist and you're doing a weighing session or a fat scoring session, and you've just seen this pony, and then somebody brings out this one, it's what score do you give it? You've already allocated a 5 to the previous pony. And it's tempting when you're on a yard to think, well, my fat pony isn't as fat as your very fat pony, and the temptation is to slide the scale. And our own team that go around with the weigh bridges and doing yard clinics for people can fall into the same trap. It's like, how do I score this one? And the fact of the matter is that they are both obese, and they're both overweight, and you've got to do something about it. They are going to be borderline sort of subclinical laminitis if they haven't actually got it there and then. So don't be tempted to slide the scale and think, well, actually, just because your pony isn't the fattest one on the yard, it doesn't matter. Both are equally as important. And it's quite possible that the Exmoor pony that's not quite so fat would be the first one to go down with laminitis before the other one, because there are other contributing factors to the problem. So don't be lulled into a false sense of security that you haven't got the fattest one on the yard. So now we've established what a fat pony looks like, how do we find the right sort of forage or the right diet for them? And there are different strategies. So the track system has become very popular in recent times, where you can allow them to move around the field. You're not confining them to such a small space, and they can see their friends and move with their friends up and down the field. If their friend is in the middle, they can move around with them. But obviously, if you've got a range of horses on a yard, and this little chap on the left here obviously needs to have a lot less than some of the bigger companions he has, then you sometimes the only option is to fence off a smaller area. But reducing intake is key. Now, we often get told that horses live on fresh air, and the fact of the matter is they don't. That isn't physically possible. They might be good doers and live off very little, but they are still getting something. And one of the sort of ways you can see how much they're actually consuming is fence off another little bit of area that they're not grazing and just see how much grass comes through maybe in a week or two. It doesn't take long for that grass to appear when something isn't eating it. And you'd be quite surprised at when you take the horse off just how much is there. And obviously what is happening is that the horse's world is keeping its bare. They are eating that grass, and that's why it remains a bare paddock. So just because it looks like there's nothing there, don't sort of be fooled and think it means the horse isn't getting anything, because it very much is. Now, this is what I would call a bare paddock, and sometimes it is the only way to get complete control over what's going into your horse out in the paddock. So it's becoming increasingly popular to have these wood chip areas. They do tend to be quite small because that's what's practical, but clearly it's bigger than a stable. And again, they can be outside. It's encouraging a little bit more movement, and they can see their friends again over the fence. It's not quite so confined or contained as a stable. So when we're really dealing with a very obese animal and we want to get complete control over what's going in, this might be the only option, or the best way to really take the matter in hand and get some results. If you can't do any of that, well, the next best thing, I guess, rather than bringing them into a stable for quite so long, is a grazing muzzle. Now, I appreciate some people don't like using them. Some horses are very adept at escaping from them. And if, it is a kind of last resort if you're not able to restrict, perhaps in other ways, but generally would be preferable to stabling for long periods of time. And research has shown that they tend to reduce intake by around 75 to 80%. And actually my colleague Tracy is sat here with me in the room. She did her master's degree dissertation and basically found that sort of level, which was then again repeated by a researcher called Annette Longland, and she found about the same reduction as well. So two separate studies finding that same reduction, which is really good and obviously very effective. But if you don't like using them, then, or your horse escapes from them, they might not be the most practical options. So they're the sort of top tips for dealing with the pasture and the turnout. When it comes to the forage, the basic rule, I guess, is to try and feed enough. And I've put a scale here in terms of what is enough. Well, 1.5% is generally what we're aiming for, and we would be quite happy with that. If you can get away with feeding ad lib and your horse doesn't put on too much weight, then that's a happy day, isn't it? That we can put as much forage in, we're keeping the gut healthy, all our fears of things like ulcers and too little fibre and the problems it might be causing go away if the horse can have as much as he wants. And that 1.5% is really what we're aiming for as a sort of acceptable minimum. As soon as we start to go below that, then we're starting to have a slightly less happy nutritionist space. So 1.25% of body weight, it's kind of borderline, isn't it? We know a lot of racehorses historically were on less than that, and they do survive, but they are notorious for having problems and being extremely vulnerable to having gastric ulcers as a result. And then when we start to get down to 1% and even below 1%, that's when our eyebrows start to raise and we have concerns. So, we have to be pragmatic. We have to work out what is the biggest threat to this horse's health at any point in time. And if it's seriously obese and overweight, we might take more drastic measures and try and monitor them closely to avoid other issues like ulcers. But in a happy scenario, we'd be feeding every horse ad lib forage if we could. So that's the sort of quantities we're looking at. And then we start to think about, well, what quality of forage have we got? And the lower the calorie content of it, then it's quite simply the more you can feed. So once we've established we want to try and get 1.5% body weight minimum, if we can actually feed them a lower calorie one, well, then they can start to have more because they get more chew time without gaining weight and condition quite so much. Well, what impacts the sort of calorie values of different fibres? Well, this sort of little image here really starts with the lower end of the spectrum, and that would be your typical straw, so around about 4 megajoules per kilo digestible energy. And then at the opposite end of the spectrum for our sort of high fibre materials, we've got something like sugar beet, which would be around about 11 megajoules of digestible energy. So to give you some context for that, something like a cool mix would be around 10 megajoules, maybe a high fibre cube, perhaps 8, 9 in that spectrum, and then a performance or conditioning feed would be somewhere in the region of 12 to 13 megajoules. So you can see how the fibre, the fibres fit into that spectrum or scale. And it really comes down to digestibility. That's what's different between the straw and the sugar beet. So sugar beet is grown underground. It doesn't need a lot of structural or lignified fibrous material in it to hold it upright because it's surrounded by soil. Whereas something that a plant that grows above ground that actually needs some stability and structure to keep it upright, that's the material that has the most indigestible or most sort of lignified structural compounds or components to keep it upright when the wind's blowing and when people are tramping through it. So anything that's old and tall, like a tree, becomes very indigestible. It's very lignified. Anything that's young and fresh, like fresh spring grass, is going to be much more digestible. And that's really what we're looking for. So for a good doer, then we can start to consider the use of straw. And Jamie mentioned it earlier in the context of ulcers. Now, first of all, we've got to be able to chew it. So when we put it into the horse, are they going to be able to chew this sort of highly indigestible material and break it down? If their teeth are okay, there's absolutely no reason why they shouldn't. Like any new feed, you'd introduce it gradually and build up, and ideally you would mix it with another forage. And we tend to suggest around about 30% of the total forage intake as straw. There are some cases where we go up to 50%, products like the hi-fi range. All right, we're not feeding them necessarily as a complete forage source in many cases, but they are around a 50-50 mix of straw with alfalfa or grass, whatever else it might be. But generally, when you're considering it as a forage, around 30% is a good sort of starting point. And as Jamie alluded to, when straw is the sole source of forage, it was a Scandinavian study, and they found it did actually increase the risk of ulcers. But it's very unusual for anyone in the UK, certainly in contrast to Scandinavia, where they use quite a lot of straw as forage. We don't tend to do that quite so much here. And you can soak or steam it to remove the dust and improve its hygienic quality if you need to. But I think it's a great way if you are on a yard and maybe your livery package includes your forage and you've only got something like a really good haylage available to you, which is completely unsuitable for your good doer, then diluting it with some straw is quite a useful way to get through the winter, provide plenty of forage without too many calories. Again, I'm sorry, there's lots of words on this slide, but it's just to make the point, because we get a lot of people thinking, oh, my horse can't have sugar, or it becomes really excitable or silly behaviour or something like that when it's fed a lot of sugar. But it is important to note that there is sugar in grass. If horses are turned out for even a few hours, it's actually contributing quite a bit of sugar relative to the rest of their ration. And just as a guide, simple sugars, so the things like glucose or whatever, would be around about a kilo of simple sugar in your 10 kilos of hay that you might be feeding to, say, a 500 kilo horse. Now, that doesn't include things like storage sugars. You might have heard the term fructans. This is just the simple sugars, and you're getting a kilo. And that would actually give you around 16 megajoules of energy. But obviously that's not all they're getting. So the fibre in there contributes, and those other storage sugars are contributing energy. So it's a small, proportion of the amount the horse would need in a day, but it's still sugar. And it still means that most horses are consuming sugar, and most sugar in a horse's ration is coming from the forage that they're given. As a guide, a hay would be, in terms of energy value, somewhere in the region of 8 to 10 megajoules per kilo digestible energy. So again, in that sort of high fibre cube sort of territory. Late cuts tend to be less, less digestible, so more indigestible. Okay, so if you're able to, if you get your forage from your local farmer, why not ask them to harvest it, later in the year, sort of late July, August time, rather than something cut in May, June. And I also just wanted to mention here as well that we think a more accurate term for what we've historically called haylage would actually be wrapped hay. In many incidents, when we do the forage analysis, the dry matter is almost, well, it's certainly above 70%. It's almost like a hay, so between 70, maybe 80%. And actually, it's too dry to ferment. So it means that when we analyse it, there is no acidity from the fermentation because it hasn't fermented, and the sugar levels are exactly the same as in a normal hay. So wrapped hay is probably a more accurate term for it than haylage these days. And there's some benefits to it. It's obviously tends to be harvested a bit earlier than normal hay. It could be really useful for your ulcer horse that doesn't need the extra acidity from a fermented product, but it just is that little bit more digestible. So if they tend to be a poorer doer, that could actually be quite useful. But for our good doers, we really want the later cut indigestible products if possible. As another rule of thumb, if you like, the more like straw a hay looks, the more like straw it tends to be nutritionally. So if you squeeze it in your hand and it feels very coarse and stalky and very fibrous, and you can't see much leaf content in there, then it's highly likely to be less digestible and therefore better for your good doers, your laminitics, your overweight horses and ponies. Now, I've put a little question here. What do you think the highest level of water-soluble carbohydrates? So that would be your simple sugars and all your storage sugars that we've ever analysed in hay here at Dengie. And I'll give you a clue, it was in 2018, so that really, really hot summer that we had a couple of years ago, prolonged period of drought. And we recorded, certainly in my 20 years in the industry, it was the highest ever WSC that I've seen. So if anyone wants to take a guess and put it in the chat box, I will reveal the level later. So if you can't get low calorie forage and you've got hay, what are the options? Well, numerous studies have looked into the effects of soaking hay. One reported that around about 40% of owners do actually soak their hay, but the loss of water-soluble carbohydrates, so your sort of sugars, is highly variable. It really ranges from anything from sort of 9-10% right up to 50% or so. So it's not completely reliable. Yes, it's probably better than doing nothing, but if you're stuck with hay, but obviously if you can get a lower sugar, lower calorie forage, less digestible forage, that's going to be more effective in the long run. It has been shown, and again, this research was sort of funded by the people that do make the steamers, that when you soak hay, you do see an increase in the numbers of bacteria, anywhere between 1.5 and 5 times as many. I've put in here, is it harmful? Has it caused any problems? We don't know, to be perfectly honest. We've been soaking hay for a very long time and feeding it to lots of horses, and I'm not sure that we can necessarily attribute any of the problems or issues that they may have had to having soaked hay, but it's certainly something that's been found in very good, valid research. But the implications of it sounds dramatic, but the extent to which it affects our horses is potentially really unknown. Obviously, you can soak for hygiene reasons too, so to help respiratory issues in horses. And as I said, it's sort of better than not doing so, but finding a lower sugar forage would be a better option. Soaking is, again, a bit like a last resort, really, when you haven't got another option. And there obviously is that balance to be struck between everything else you're losing when you soak hay. So you're trying to get rid of all the sort of sugars, etc. But is the hay still actually edible and safe to feed? And you'll get 100 different opinions on how long to soak hay for. Our priority, I guess, is making sure it's edible and safe. So in really warm conditions, we tend to suggest a couple of hours, because otherwise it starts to ferment in the water and is not particularly palatable. In cooler conditions, then you can soak overnight without it sort of going off. So anything from a couple of hours up to maybe 12 hours or so. And the ambient temperature can have a big impact as well on how much sugar is leached out. So the warmer conditions, you do tend to get more leaching of the sugar out as well. So that's something else to bear in mind. If you can't get low calorie forage, then there are low calorie, and I've put hay or haylage replacers available. Obviously, any of the high range can be used as partial and in some cases complete forage replacers. And to be honest, even switching 2 kilos a day can make quite a big difference, especially in pony territory where, you know, if they're only maybe getting 5 kilos total of forage a day, if you can switch 2 kilos of something that's quite a nutritious haylage for a straw-based sort of low sugar hay replacer, chopped fibre type feed, then that can have a really big impact on their total intake. I'm mindful that obviously NAF are collaborating with us tonight, so you know, the hi-fi range makes a great sort of base to using supplements with. There are fortified options, but obviously you have to feed those at the recommended level. So if you don't, you're missing out on, you know, your horse isn't getting a balanced diet anyway, so you would need to top up with a supplement. And they are also a great way to extend a short supply of forage. It's quite localised, I think, this year. Some areas actually have plenty of forage, but again, in the southeast, I think it's certainly in shorter supply than it has been for a couple of years. So to try and eke your hay out and make it last a bit longer, adding 1 or 2 kilos a day of the sort of chopped fibre feeds is a great option, and you just feed it on a weight for weight basis. So a section of hay is roughly 2 kilos. So if you take a section out, put 2 kilos of chopped fibre back in. And I just wanted to use a case study, and I'm sorry if any of you have seen it before, because we do use him quite a lot, but it's basically because we have a lot of data on him, and it's really interesting to see. This is Jake, an 8-year-old Connemara who's always been a good doer. Emma, his owner, contacted us, and it was actually my colleague Claire Akers that went to see him. And this is a picture of him being lunged in the summer of 2013. You can see that picture shows his cresty neck, his round tummy, and I think beautifully shows the gutter along his back and his really round apple bottom. And so we sort of monitored him, took the weighbridge out to him, and you can see from February through to the December how we achieved some weight loss. And in total, it was a 99 kilos reduction, and that's around about, in human terms, 16 stone. So you can imagine what people would think if someone was sat on their horse all day, every day, so 24/7, 16 stone rider on a Connemara pony. If you think of it in those terms, that's what he's lugging around every single day as surplus weight that he really doesn't need. And obviously we achieved quite a good weight loss in the first couple of months. It plateaued through the summer for lots of reasons. I'm sure, you know, it's hard to get weight off horses when the grass is good or it's warmer, they're not using as much energy to keep warm. But then you use the winter months again, so autumn, winter through October, November, December, to achieve some further weight loss. And as long as it doesn't go up in the spring and summer, you know, if it varies up and down a little bit through the seasons, that's fine. As long as they lose a bit in the winter, they can afford to gain a bit in the spring. But it's when they just keep going up, we have a problem. And that was him before and after. So you can see a much happier, healthier looking pony. So that's the sort of good doer, obese side of forage strategy. When we have a veteran, and horses have been living longer and starting to outlive their teeth, not being able to sort of eat half of your diet potentially soon results in weight loss. You know, imagine taking half your calories out and how quickly you drop condition. So the strategy here is pretty much the opposite to what we do with a good doer. We've got to supply fibre or forage in an easy to chew form. And a few years ago, we funded a study where we compared different fibre types, and we had admittedly 2 fairly small groups, but we had some with what we'd consider to be normal dentition, and then a group of veterans with, you know, poor nutrition, dentition, that had trouble or difficulty chewing forage. And so we compared the 2. We used Hi-Fi Senior, so that's a grass and alfalfa blend, and then a soaked combination of alfalfa and sugar beet, and compared it to hay. And we found that on nearly half of the occasions, the horses with a poor dentition actually refused the hay altogether. They didn't even bother going to try and chew it. When we chopped, provided them with a chop in the form of a Hi-Fi product, then you only got 6% refusal. And when you give them the soaked mash, they don't refuse it at all, which goes to show there is an appetite there. They want to eat, funnily enough, but we just need to give it to them in a form that they can manage. And when we did compare those that managed some hay, in the same time period, they consumed about 2/3 less than the horses with a normal dentition. So if you have got an older horse with poor teeth and they're kept in groups with others, you really do need to consider that if you're offering them one sort of source of forage between the group. It's highly likely they're going to be missing out because they just can't consume it quite as quickly as their field mates. So what can you do in this scenario? Well, obviously using a short chop fibre as a hay replacer will help. You could try the sort of alfalfa with high temperature dried grasses like the Hi-Fi Senior. That would be equivalent to a really good quality hay in terms of energy value. And you just, again, replace it on a weight for weight basis. The important thing to remember with these chopped fibres is that they are very lightweight. So a scoop, large stuffed scoop, may well be as little as 300 grams. And the image there shows you the same weight of mix, sort of soaked beet and a bowl of chopped fibre. So you can see how the volumes that you need to feed differ or vary a bit according to the density or the heaviness of the product. You're still only feeding 2 kilos or whatever it might be. It's just, it takes up a lot more volume, which is great because you want the chew time for the horse. But when you're feeding it and scooping it out the bag, it just feels a little bit counterintuitive when you're putting it in a bucket because we're all conditioned to feeding little and often when it comes to bucket feed. Well, when you're dealing with fibre, that's not the case. You can treat it and consider it in the same way as you would your hay net. And obviously keep monitoring consumption, see how much they're actually eating, and then allow for the fact that if they are starting to quid really badly and dropping feed, they're missing out on that. So again, they're not consuming perhaps as much as they should. And another little case study for you. So this is Chewy, and again, this is Tracy's sort of contact who she's been to see over a number of years. I believe he's on her yard. Connemara Cross, 26 years old, had first had laminitis at 9 years of age, and then recurring bouts in 2010, 2011, which I think was the point at which his owner really needed to or decided to take action. He had EMS and then was latterly diagnosed with PPID, which you might be more familiar with as Cushing's. And this was a picture of him before, and this is him after, and he was about a 10 stone 9 pounds lighter. And this goes back to, sometimes I put this slide up at riding clubs and it's really disconcerting doing it on a computer because I can't see or hear anybody's reaction. But if we put this up on a riding club talk, sometimes people are sort of like, oh, he's a bit thin. But this is the point that I sort of made earlier when we're condition scoring. There are some horses where it's appropriate to be under a 3, so a 2.5, because we're managing them with the risk of laminitis, etc. in mind. I think sometimes it can go too far, and we see horses that are really too thin and have been almost sort of starved to try and get their PPID or EMS or whatever under control, and that's not ideal. But this sort of condition score or fat score is spot on for a horse that we're just mindful of the laminitis risk. And again, some great data to show the fluctuations and where he started from and where he ends up. So this was from 2011 right through to 2015. And you can see how we've really worked hard, and credit to the owners in all these scenarios. They've taken on board the advice and dealt with the issue. Plateaus again for a little bit. Sometimes you take your eye off the ball in the spring and you see it starting to creep back up. But as I said earlier, as long as it comes back down in the autumn and the winter, you can afford to go through that natural fluctuation. And that is what nature intended for them to do. And just to show that there are lots of ways you can do it, 5 kilos of hay split into 2, obviously muzzled in this scenario, vitamin and mineral supplement, and sort of limited turnout. So it's not difficult, and it doesn't have to be expensive either. You can get good results with a simple ration. And just lastly, in the groups of forage for different horses and scenarios, the underweight horse, as I mentioned earlier, wrapped hay, where you've dried it almost to a hay and then wrapped it so you haven't really got the fermentation, tends to be harvested earlier than very sort of traditional old hay, so it's much softer. True diet to ferment, so it's not acidic, useful for the possible ulcer case, and obviously feed it ad lib if you've got an underweight horse. And I've put turnout if the horse is happy there, because some horses are not particularly used to being turned out, but they genuinely are almost sort of agoraphobic and get stressed by being out in the field, especially if for whatever reason you can't bring them in at the same time as everyone else, it can be more damaging to be out. So whilst it's what we generally always want, it's not always possible. And there's a typical example of what you can do feed-wise, and I'm sure Kate is going to talk in much more detail about supplements and digestive aids to get the gut working more efficiently. Dentition issues, they're not always the old horse. So a diastema is a problem that's being increasingly diagnosed. Jamie might comment later actually on whether it's something that's an increasing problem, or is it just we're seeing it more, diagnosing it more often. It's always been there, but we just didn't know about it. In those scenarios, then a softer chop using something like a grass-based fibre, or if they can't even manage that, you can go as far as soaking up grass pellets or alfalfa pellets, something like that, and basically making sure, again, a bit like the older horses, they've got something in a format they can actually eat. If you're balancing that with an issue of laminitis as well, then that's the scenario where you'd go for a lower sugar option, and you might use something like a high fibre cube as well. But just to finish on a positive, and again, proving, I suppose, in a way that the right fibre and the right horse works. This is another case study, Alicia Wilkinson, who is one of our supported riders. You can follow her blog on our website. Who is the horse's stable name? I can never remember what its sort of show or competition name is. But anyway, she was diagnosed with diastemas, and as a result of not being able to consume enough fibre, had also developed gastric ulcers and lost quite a lot of weight very quickly. So when the nutrition team went out to see her and got her on a diet, they put her on to grass pellets soaked with some beet, alpha beet, and the Performance Plus balancer. So she then went round a 3-star 3-day event in Tattersalls Island, and I think just looks in super condition. She's very fit. She's got the muscle tone in the top line. You can just see her ribs there, which I hope you can see. And it just goes to show you don't have to feed high levels of cereals to get a horse into amazing condition and to be able to compete at really high levels. So thank you for listening. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, and I will hand you across to Kate just as soon as I make the technology work for me. Okay.
Right. Oh, yeah. Oh, right. There we are. I think we're transferred. Thank you, Katie. All right. So let's get my screen up. Right, there we go. Right, good evening, everybody. My name's Kate, and I'm the head nutritionist at NAF. I'd like to start by thanking our organisers this evening, and thanking Denji for running the tech side of things as well. So hopefully we've got you to this point in the evening, and we're all still, the technology is all still working just about. So I'm following on from two very good speakers, and hopefully taking it in a slightly different direction now, and talking about optimizing gut function in the horse, and really thinking about, I'm sure all of us are looking out our windows this evening and hearing the wind and rain, and we know we're coming into winter. So we're going to think about how we can improve our horses' defences against the challenges of winter. So in order to do that, we're going to look at the immune system, and really how the supplementary support can help the immune system by supporting the microbiota, the population in the hindgut, but also by helping that mucosa that Jamie talked about earlier on in his talk. And we'll talk about the very specific role that has within the immune system, and not just for prevention of gastric ulcers. So starting off with a quick look at the immune system, this is what we want. We want a nice strong defense. We want your horse to be able to fight off anything that is coming their way and get through all the challenges of winter. And they'll do that in two basic ways. through the systemic immune system, but also through a system known as MALT, which you may not be so familiar with, some of you may be, and that's a really interesting area that we're going to come on and talk about. But we'll start off with perhaps what we're a little more familiar with, which is the systemic immune system. So this is the immune system that's circulating around the blood, around the whole body, and it's run by lots of different immune cells and lots of quite a complex interactions. But the ones we're most familiar with are the lymphocytes or the white blood cells. So these white blood cells, I think we all learnt about at school, if an awful long time ago to my school days. But if I drag my brain back, I can remember being told about white blood cells. And these white blood cells start off in the bone marrow. That's where they're produced, and then they get out into the bloodstream, and that's where they go around fighting fires effectively. That's where they go around tackling anything, any antigens, allergens, bacteria, viruses, anything that shouldn't be there, and they can denature them in several different ways, depending on what type of lymph cell they are. But they tackle those challenges. So they're produced in the bone marrow, and because of that, we refer to the bone marrow as being primary lymphoid tissue. So that's where it all starts, if you like. And certainly, it's very easy to think, very easy to sort of assume that it goes from the bone marrow into the bloodstream, but that is not the case. There's a very important step in the middle, and that is this MALT, this MALT system. And the MALT is short for mucosal associated lymphoid tissue. So really, if we take a quick step back at this point, the immune system starts on the outside, and it starts with our skin. Okay, so our skin is the outer layer of the immune system, and that's the first defense barrier that anything trying to attack us has got to get past. But once it's got past that, the next layer it's going to come across is a mucosal layer. So that mucosal layer may be in the lungs, where we call it BALT, the bronchus-associated lymphoid tissue, or it may be this guy, the GALT, the gut-associated lymphoid tissue. And this is the one we're really interested in this evening, because it's a really important part of immunity. So imagine that the allergen or the antigen, whatever the attacking agent is, virus, bacteria, piece of dust, if you like, imagine that's been swallowed, it's got into the gut, but it's got to get past this gut-associated lymphoid tissue. Okay, so in order to do that, let me find a laser pointer if I can. There we go. So we touched on the digestive system earlier, and I'm certainly not going to go through it in a great deal of detail. But what I want you to think about is the digestive system as one long tube, all the way through the body from one end to the other. Same applies to us, to our dog, to our cats, any mammal pretty much. We've got a tube starting at this end in the mouth, goes all the way through into the stomach, small intestines, cecum, large intestine, and out the other end. So that tube is continuous. And the reason that's important is you need to think of your horse, and maybe this is an easy analogy with some of the things Katie's been saying, but think of your horse as one large complicated donut. And the reason, now I know it's a little bit unusual, but come with me on this. If we imagine the tube being unbroken, which it is, from the mouth through to the anus, it's a continuous tube. If we imagine an unbroken tube, then anything that is inside the gut is not yet inside the horse. The horse surrounds the gut, and this is what's going through the middle. And the reason that's important is because in order to get from the gut into the horse, it has to get past this mucosal layer, the gut-associated lymphoid tissue. And it works the opposite way as well. If the horse is excreting excesses, dumping into the gut, maybe excess water and such like, or waste material, then that goes from the horse through that same mucosal layer into the gut. So it's a two-way process. But really, really important is this barrier here. And this is one of the main parts of the immune system in the horse. Okay, so from now on, we can think of ourselves as just complicated donuts, and our horses too. So this gut mucosal lining actually has a really difficult job to do, because if we think about it, the lining has to be very thin and delicate. It has to be permeable, and that permeability has to be two-way. And the reason it has to be all those is because obviously this is where the digestion takes place, whether it's up in the stomach, the small intestine, or into the large intestine, or actually right up into the mouth. So all the way along the digestive system, you have this mucosal lining in various different forms, and this thin, delicate, permeable two-way. Certainly within the digestive system itself, we're looking at a very complex two-way system. I think just in the background here, you can see the finely folded, they're known as villi, but they're like little finger protrusions. And the reason they look like that is essentially to give the gut an even bigger surface area than it already has. So there's lots of opportunity for this two-way traffic. And yet, in the middle of all that, it also has to be the first line of defense. So the gut has to be able to allow things in, allow things out, but it also has to be able to recognize those things that shouldn't be there and stop them getting in. So really, really important in immunity. And the majority of it, certainly you find reported, the majority of infectious agents enter through the gut. So again, really important. So if we just have a slightly closer look at it, because it comes secondary to the bone marrow, it's known as the secondary lymphoid tissue. So those lymphocytes that started off in the bone marrow, they don't go straight into the bloodstream. They actually go from the bone marrow into this gut-associated lymphoid tissue, and that's where they mature. So this is the secondary lymphoid tissue. But it represents at least 70% of the immune system. It's actually the largest immune organ in your body, and not just your horse. Horses have huge digestive systems, as we know, so very, very important to them. But even in our own digestive system, we're looking at 70 to 80% of our immunity comes from this gut tissue. So really important to be thinking about that for strength. It's complex of lots of different immune cells and structures, things like macrophages, lymphocytes. I am not going to try and go through all of them this evening, you'll be pleased to know. Because it would take some time. But I've just put them up here to give you an idea of the complexity. The T cells and B cells are involved in adaptive learning. The M cells are the mucosal cells that help to cover this whole surface area. So the macrophages and lymphocytes are adapting to challenge. So all sorts of different things going on in this immune system. It's anti-allergic, antibacterial, can deal with viruses, it produces antibodies. And what's really clever is these lymphocytes that have come from the bone marrow into the gut. Once they have learnt their trade effectively, once they've recognized the attacking agents and they've formed antibodies, they've formed they've learnt the attack, they are then put back into the systemic immune system to inform the rest of the immune system. Effectively, the lymphocytes come to the gut to go to school. They learn what's attacking, and then they tell the rest of them. All very clever stuff, all very complex. And, you know, we don't have time for an immunology lecture this evening, but all we have to remember is the gut is responsible for at least 70% of total immunity. So once we understand that, we better understand the importance of looking after the gut and looking after the strength of the horse in general. So how can we boost their gut-based immunity? I chose this picture. This is actually one of my colleagues and her friend on a recent fun ride. Chose this picture because I think it shows the challenges of winter very well. Don't they look happy in that? They actually do look quite happy, but in that cold, wet conditions. And that's a good thing to remember for horses when it comes to challenges. Katie mentioned earlier about horses, particularly our natives, being very happy and healthy out in cold weather, as indeed they are. Horses have a very wide thermoneutral zone, so they are happy and comfortable down to 0 degrees, 5 degrees, that sort of area. But what they don't like is cold and wet. So a day like that day with that rain is certainly challenging to them. So we can boost their gut-based immunity by feeding the high fiber diet that both Jamie and Katie have talked about. We do start to, when nutritionists get together, we start to sound like a stuck record, because whatever problem you're talking about with a horse, you keep coming back to a high fiber diet and feeding horses as horses, and it is really important. So feeding that high fiber diet, balancing the diet, and then getting more into the digestive system to support the microbiota and providing some more complex dietary fibers as well. And I'll come on to why that's important a little bit later. So feeding the high fiber diet, have no intention of going over this, as I say, Katie's done a very good job. So we've got a really thorough basis of basing all diets on grazing and forages and fibre-based feeds. But we do like Thelwell here at NAF, so I just wanted to put this picture up because I think any of the horse owners amongst us recognise this image and can sympathise with poor Fiona there lugging the hay and forage around. But really important, and of course that little pony can't manage on tinned food like her dog can. So from the high fiber diet, the first thing we need to do is to balance that diet, and that's because we may see imbalances, particularly in preserved forage. So things like vitamins, some of the vitamins such as vitamin A, vitamin E are actually very well provided by fresh grazing. So over spring and summer, when they're out on the fresh grazing, they should be getting reasonable amounts. But those levels drop away markedly with preserved forages. Similarly, in winter, I think the advice from most health professionals these days is that all of us in the UK should be taking additional vitamin D, which is the sunshine vitamin. And I think we can think about that for our horses as well, because of increased time stabling, increased rugging. They won't perhaps have as much availability from sun-sourced vitamin D. Minerals and trace elements are also very important for general health and vitality. And in the purely forage-based diet, or if you're not feeding the recommended amount of a concentrate feed, then you're not going to be getting those minerals and trace elements. They can be lacking in our soils, and that deficiency works its way through to the grazing and to the forage. Typically in the UK, we see things like selenium deficiency, zinc, copper deficiency could all occur, and those deficiencies vary across the year. So if you are getting soil and grazing analysed, which I think is a very good thing to do, I would recommend you, perhaps if you're on a livery yard, get together with a few of your friends and get some forage and soil analysis done. But do repeat it throughout the year at key times throughout the year, because it will change throughout the year. So it is a good idea to feed a balancer to balance that diet. So something like our Optimum, which is a concentrated balancer and can be fed either on its own or ideally in a fibre-based diet. And then the general purpose supplement for people who prefer to feed powders. So once we've got the fibre-based diet and we've balanced it for vitamins and minerals, then we can start looking at supporting the gut microbiota. So this is the huge population that exists in the throughout the digestive system, but we tend to think about them primarily in the hindgut. So we've got things like bacteria, yeast, protozoa, and they all make up the microbiota. Now, you may have heard, maybe in human health or equine health, the two terms microbiota and microbiome. They are not entirely interchangeable. They're very similar, but there are a couple of differences. And as a general rule, when we're talking about the microbiome, then we're talking about the entire microbial population for that animal. So that would be the microbes that live on your skin. There are plenty of them. The microbes in your gut, in your lungs, so your whole microbial population. If you're talking about the microbiota, then it tends to be the microbial population in a particular area. So here we're talking about the gut microbiota, the population in the digestive tract. Okay, so microbial digestion. We all know that they're a very large population, but we're going to have I'm going to give you another quick guessing game. You can put your answers in the notes in the chat box. I will give you the answer shortly, actually, but just maybe think to yourself, if we take 1 milliliter of cecal fluid, so 1 milliliter is, you take your typical teaspoon, and it's 1/5 of a teaspoon. So in 1/5 of a teaspoon, how many of these bacteria and yeasts and such like do we think there are? This is where I would normally stand and wait for you to shout answers at me, but obviously we can't do that this evening. So, you know, maybe 100,000, maybe 1 million, something like that. Actually, what we're talking about is approximately 1 billion. So in 1 milliliter, 1/5 of a teaspoon, we're looking at 1 billion bacteria. So when we size that up to the size of the hindgut and the size of the small intestine and stomach, which also has some microbial population, you can really see the size of the population we're talking about. We used to say there are 10 times as many microbes as there are cells in the body. I don't know that that's ever been proven as a fact, but I like it as a line. So again, it's quite a complex makeup. Predominantly, we're looking at the cellulitic bacteria, which digest fiber, produce energy through volatile fatty acids. But we've also got bacteria doing jobs like digesting protein. We've got fungi and yeast, which again get into the fibers. We've got the protozoa, which again are helping to produce volatile fatty acids or energy. So all the good guys there working away in quite a complex mix. And then in the red on the right hand side there, you've got the lactic acid producing bacteria that digest starch. These are the ones we want to keep a lid on and keep their production down as much as possible, because these are the bad guys. These are the ones that if they get out of control, we're looking at acidosis and all sorts of associated problems. So we need to make sure that we're feeding low levels of starch, if any at all, to reduce those lactic acid bacteria. Okay, so really important that we keep that microbiota in a good, healthy balance. And imbalance, unfortunately, are relatively easy. They can be caused by diet changes, a natural diet, for example, a high cereal diet, or feeding meal feeds rather than trickle feeding. Antibiotics are very useful and necessary in the right place, but we all know about the problems of antibiotic resistance, and that is an area that we're all addressing. But antibiotics also, you know, they go in and they kill the bad bugs, but they also kill the good bugs. So they can certainly upset the microbiota, as can illness. And microbiota homeostasis is intrinsically linked to immunity itself. So far we've talked about perhaps the two main players in the digestive system, certainly in terms of health and vitality. We've talked about the gut-associated lymphoid tissue, the GALT, and the microbiota. So how do we think these two guys get on? You know, are they working together? Are they working against each other? Do they have nothing to do with each other? Well, you perhaps guess that they work very closely together. together. So this is a nice little diagram that I found in quite a recent paper, which explains quite neatly, I think, the importance of microbiome stability. Because if we get a disturbance in the microbiome, and that might come in from environmental factors, those are the diet changes, travel and illness and such like that we talked about, or genetic factors, if we get those factors influencing, then we have the microbiome disturbance. If we have immune dysregulation in that gut-associated lymphoid tissue, then what we find is that this is very much a two-way process between the two. The microbiome disturbance can negatively influence immunity, and immunity can negatively influence the microbiome. When both of them start to go wrong and start to get out of balance, then it results in disease. Okay, so these two are the two sort of pillars that hold up health, if you like. They make up the vast majority of immunity and defense, and they hold up health. If it goes wrong, we end up in a disease situation. And not necessarily just the digestive diseases that you might think of. So we think of an upset microbiome in the gastric, in the digestive tract, and we think of it in relation to things like colic, laminitis, certainly in relation to ulcers, all of these digestive conditions. But actually, the more we understand about particularly the influence of that gut-associated lymphoid tissue getting out into the system, then the more we understand that the microbiome can absolutely influence disease elsewhere. So these are just a few papers that I've found today. I should stress that these are research in humans, but this research is ongoing and certainly starting to build an idea of a similar sort of problem in horses. So wherever the issue is, I mean, in people, there's now quite a strong link between the gut microbiome and inflammatory conditions like arthritis, between the gut and respiratory disease, certainly between the gut and brain conditions like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So increasingly, we can find this gut microbiome influence in just about every disease. So again, coming back to the importance of keeping that balance between immunity and microbiome, and we do that by feeding naturally. There we go again, feed them as horses, feed them a high fiber diet, make changes gradually. One of the key golden rules of feeding is to make any change gradually, and to supplement for gut health, we can certainly get into the hindgut and help the digestion through that. So to look at how we might supplement and the sort of things that are available, I'm using a couple of our products obviously as an example, but I've put up the ingredients section there from one of our labels, but without spending too much time on legislation and law, the way we label products applies to all of us, whether we're making supplements or feeds. We all work under the same feed law, so you should see a very similar declaration on any product you make, on any product you purchase, whether it's a supplement or a feed from any manufacturer. So we might be looking at probiotics. Probiotics are perhaps the best known of the digestive supplements for the digestive system. In the EU, and the same when we do Brexit in the UK, there is actually only one live approved probiotic for horses, and it's this yeast down here, the live yeast. You'll find it on any label. You'll find it on the additives section under digestibility enhancer, and its name is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. There are a number of different strains of the same yeast that are approved for use, but there's only one yeast. If you see live bacteria or a product saying that it contains a blend of live probiotics, then please don't use it, because that's not been approved for use and it's an illegal product for horses. If you're looking at probiotics, check for the CFU number. That's this one here. So CFU number 1.4 times 10 to the 11, that's an awful lot of zeros behind it. And that's physically the number of CFU stands for colony forming unit. So that's the number of yeast colony forming units that's been included in the product. If you don't see a CFU number, you're not looking at a live yeast. And what the probiotics do is to improve fiber digestion in the hindgut. We very often feed them alongside prebiotics, and prebiotics might be something like the fructooligosaccharides, brewer's yeast, or herbal prebiotics like chicory is a really nice herbal prebiotic. Notice I've said brewer's yeast there as a prebiotic, not a probiotic. Brewer's yeast is a byproduct of the brewing industry. The clues in the name. So any live action, any of these CFUs has long been denatured, so it doesn't have that live probiotic action, but we still use it because we find it a very useful prebiotic. So that's why we tend to include it in products. And what the prebiotics do is that they fuel the probiotics. So think of the probiotic as sending the soldiers down in the defense, and think of the prebiotics as sending the soldiers with their lunchbox. So they fuel the probiotics and suppress pathogenic bacteria. What we can also do from a supplementary point is really think about this gut mucosal layer and what we can do to specifically help that mucosal layer. So that might come from particular ingredients, things like fenugreek, marshmallow, psyllium. They're all known as mucilaginous agents, herbal mucilaginous agents, and they produce mucus. I always think it's quite easy to think of marshmallow in that way, because or licorice actually, because if you think of them, they're quite sticky substances, aren't they? Marshmallow on a stick, it's quite a sticky substance, and that's effectively what they promote in the hindgut. So they're directly helping that gut-associated lymphoid tissue. What we can also do is think about increasing fiber diversity. So in a lot of our products, you'll see that we use quite a blend of different herbs. So we've got rosehip, milk thistle, the chicory, the omica, turmeric. And what that is doing is increasing the diversity of fiber, and that has been shown to increase microbial richness, which is the number of species in this hindgut population. I've just pulled up a couple of papers here from a certainly one of the last conferences we were able to attend, so many have been postponed this year. And that's the European Equine Health and Nutrition Congress in Utrecht last year. And the whole theme of that Congress actually was thinking about the small things and thinking about the microbiome. But these two separate papers, one by Joan Edwards and one Muriel Moore-Collier, both talked about not only feeding fibre, but feeding a diversity of fibre, and putting back a bit of the diversity that the horse would have in their natural environment. We do use these herbs for other reasons as well. Some of them might be antioxidant, adaptogenic, immune boosting, but this role here, the fiber diversity, shouldn't be ignored. It's a really useful reason for using these ingredients. So how important is a healthy microbiome to your horse or pony this winter? It's obviously important for diet utilization and also for nutrient production. A lot of the B vitamins are produced from the microbiota in the hindgut. It's absolutely integral to immunity, as we've discussed so far in this talk. Helps to keep them warm. Digesting fiber in that with microbial fermentation produces lots of lovely body heat, so it does help to keep them warm. And it may even help to keep them calm and happy. Certainly something that researchers are starting to look at is whether their gut microbes talk directly to their brain through this gut-brain axis and the effect on behavior and mood. So it's something we're beginning to consider, that a healthy gut, we know a healthy gut makes a happy horse. Happy gut, happy horse. We've always known that that's to do with starch digestion, reducing the starch, increasing fiber, but increasingly research in horses as well as in people is finding this gut-brain axis linking behaviour and mood. I'm not going to say any more about it this evening because we don't have time to. Maybe that's another whole webinar in itself, but the gut-brain axis, really fascinating thing. So how important again is this microbe, the microbiome to your horse's health? Well, it's this important. A stable, healthy microbiome gives you a strong immune system, gives you a happy, healthy horse or pony. It is absolutely fundamental, not only to your horse's defense system, but to their ability to work and to stay happy and healthy. So, to conclude, we can optimize gut function in horses by fine-tuning that fiber-based diet this winter and by providing supplementary support for a balanced diet, but also for the microbiota and for that gut-associated lymphoid tissue. We can supplement to help their immune defenses as well as their microbiota. Okay. So that was me, optimizing gut function in horses, your horse's best defense against the challenges of winter. Thank you for your attention. I will stop my screen share and hopefully pop the host back to Katie.
Oh, thank you so much, Kate. That was brilliant. And apologies, in my effort to get away from presenting, I managed to not introduce you properly. So apologies.
Oh, no, that's okay.
I did type it into the chat box, the fact that I think it's great that you work with Team GBR and NAF in particular support the British team, and I'm sure we're all disappointed that the Olympics didn't happen this year, but hopefully things will look up for next year. So, and also I just wanted to say thank you. In the background, Kat is actually Jamie's wife, hiding off camera, I think somewhere, and she's also works for NAF and has in an email or two to me described herself as Jamie's PA. So thank you, Kat, if you can hear us, for organising everything behind the scenes. So without further ado, I do have some questions that have been coming in, which I've compiled into little groups. Jamie, if we start with you, if that's okay.
Yep.
Question, we have a human doctor in the audience, I believe, who has asked, out of curiosity, what sort of doses do horses have compared to humans? She's quoted, I think it's a lady actually, 20 to 40 for humans. How does it compare with the horse, please?
Oh, it's 4 milligrams per kilo of omeprazole. That's the dose rate in a standard dose. I need to look at it, but it's something like that, like which you can reduce to 1 if you're treating for a prolonged period of time.
Yeah. So for a 500 kilo horse, so with it 4 per kilo, so it would be 200 milligrams. So about at least 10 times, around 10 times what the human would be. So quite interesting. Another one was, again, I think, Kate, possibly more for you, well, specifically for you, vitaferrin versus a general supplement in the context of a leisure horse. Which would you recommend?
Oh, okay. So vitaferrin is our liquid vitamin and mineral supplement. I think you may have gathered from my talk that my preference is actually for something like the Optimum, because it has all that gut support in it and it has those essential fibers in it. Vitaferrin is I've got a little poll popped up.
Sorry,
that's okay. Vitaferrin is useful particularly for horse. You do get, particularly with performance horses, you sometimes get a bit of inappetence, and maybe if they've got, maybe if they're having a joint supplement and they're having maybe a skin supplement, and then you put something else in, they're thinking, oh no, not another powder. So sometimes a liquid vitamin and mineral is useful in that regard. But personally, from a nutritionist point of view, I prefer things like the Optimum because it's got the pre and probiotics in it, and those that complex of digestive fibers in that you obviously can't get in a liquid.
Okay, lovely, thank you. Jamie, there was a question from some viewers. I think you mentioned antimicrobials. Could you just expand a little bit more on why you would use that, and sort of, actually the question I think was what they are and why you would use it?
I usually use, it depends really, like it's just really as I was saying about when you've got severe ulceration in the squamous mucosa, and also in the glandular area, and you've got fibrinous suppurative lesions where there's exudate and there's almost pus-like lesions in the glandular mucosa. The mucosa has been damaged. I use sort of trimethoprim sulfasalazine is usually the antibiotic of choice, and because that's excreted really, really well in the gut. I just find, and there's lots of, the problem is there isn't a lot of studies. I've been doing research for the talk. There isn't a lot of studies about whether you should feed antimicrobials, because as Kate has said in her talk, antimicrobials kill good and bad bacteria.
Yeah.
So in the sense of, if you've got compromise to the gut, you don't really want to be, causing more compromise and killing off the good bacteria. You want to be killing off the pathogens. But it's just in those situations where there's really bad lesions, I will give a 5-day to 7-day course of trimethoprim sulfates, like those antibiotics which are like Noradine or trimazidine powders. They're the kind of the antibiotics I give, which are just oral. They're broad spectrum, but they're not very, very aggressive to the system. So they're not going to cause, they're not very, very hard on the system. They're not going to cause damage to the gut or damage to the microflora in the sense that the horse will get scoured. You just want the nicest, kindest antibiotic. That's what I usually do. Not the whole time. It's not in every horse that has ulcers. It's only the ones that are like grade 4 plus and glandular ulcers as well.
Yeah. Great, thank you. And Kate, the same person asked about sort of nutraceuticals. Do you want to just perhaps expand or explain a little bit more on nutraceuticals as what they are? And
sorry, for gastric ulcers, is that, or?
Yeah, I think just generally a definition of what they
actually what
are.
Nutraceutical is. Okay, yeah. So supplements and nutraceuticals, they're all quite interesting terms in that legally they don't exist. Legally, all of our products are actually feed. So we use these terms to try and explain what they're doing. So a supplement, I always say a supplement supplements the diet, makes up a shortfall in the diet, if you like. Nutraceuticals are those supplements that are trying to do a particular job on top of a balanced diet. So a joint product, respiratory product, gastric ulcer product. And it's just a smashing together of the words from nutrition and pharmaceutical effectively. So it's using nutrition as a therapy tool. Nothing new. Hippocrates back in however many thousand years BC talked about food being your medicine. So it's nothing new, but we just give it a new name.
It's another one of those, I think they call them portmanteau words, isn't it? Like
yeah.
To stick them together and come up with a new one. But
but interestingly, legally it doesn't exist. Yeah. Legally, what we're selling is feed. It all comes under, and that's something, again, not to get into details, but we sometimes hear, feed supplements have anything in them. There's no law controlling them, and that is so far. Believe me, my job would be so much easier if there was no legislation involved. But actually, supplements are legislated every bit as much as feed, because they are feed. So all of our ingredients are declared just as you would on a bag of feed.
Perfect, thank you. And there's a specific question about, would you recommend a gut balancer? And also sort of general question about which supplements would you recommend for an ex-racer? I think that was directed at both Jamie and Kate, actually, if either of you have got comments on
that. Well, Jamie, do you want to go first, or do you want me to?
Let you go first.
You let me go, thank you. So again, another little quick bit of legislation here. Another thing that supplements are very often blamed of or accused of is having no research and having no, why don't we see your research? Why don't we see your evidence, etc., etc. And without spending too long on it, the basic rule is we are not allowed to make any medical claims. So that's why you see a lot of quite woolly language like maintain and support and all that sort of thing. So the short answer to your question is that I can't actually, legally, I can't tell you about the effect of supplements on gastric ulcers, because that would be making a medical claim. But the GastroVet product that you saw in the talk has been researched. There is a peer-reviewed published paper on it, but the Veterinary Medicines Directorate, the VMD, who very much control what we're allowed to say and do, they would not like it if I was to show you the detail, the results of that paper. So GastroVet is the product I would recommend. It's the one I would recommend in the short term to follow on from Jamie's omeprazole. So we normally recommend introducing it alongside the omeprazole for towards the end of that treatment, so that you get a nice smooth transfer, and then for most horses, not all, but for most, they would swap over onto the GastroAid once their new management and regime was in place. But GastroVet and then GastroAid, and also the oils that Jamie mentioned, they're quite useful they're useful both for protecting the digestive system, and also they're a useful way of providing energy without feeding starch.
I think also, just butting in on the answers and some information, what was really interesting was a paper published possibly last year or maybe even the year before. I think the Waltham group looked at treating ulcers and not changing diet, and treating ulcers and changing the diet. And unsurprisingly, I guess, to us and most people, funnily enough, when you change the diet and change your feeding practices, you got a much better improvement with the medication.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
there was actually some published data to support that. So again, I know, as we discussed earlier, it's not always possible to do it, but if you can make that effort and implement some fairly fundamental changes to your regime, you will get a much better result of whatever treatments you're going to use.
And all of our products have their place. None of us would say that any of us have got the total answer. Certainly we haven't for gastric ulcers. Certainly we wouldn't go out and say that feed this product and you don't need your vet, or you don't need your hay net, because that would be a ridiculous thing for us to say. But our product plays its part, just as having a nice high fiber diet, just as seeing the vet when the horse needs the vet. So it's all part of the overall regime.
Definitely. Just one more, actually, I think fairly quickly I can answer with feeding straw. Yes, if you can get chopped straw in bags, plain straw, that's great, but you can use baled straw. So it's quite a cost-effective way to feed. Just like I said, introduce it gradually, as long as your horse hasn't got dental issues, or a history of impaction colic or something like that, then obviously that wouldn't be a good idea. But it can be a really useful way to increase your fibre, your amount of fibre you can use. So that's covers off that one. The answer to my quiz question was actually the hay we analysed in 2018 was about 35% water-soluble carbohydrates, and the target really for our NSC, which includes your starch and things as well, for a laminitic would be around 10-12%. How achievable that is up for debates, and I'm a bit sceptical about it in terms of actually getting to that level, to be honest. But yeah, it just goes to show how much variation you can get. So bear that in mind. Right, I've got some other.
And I think, sorry, just to say very quickly on that point, I think that raises a really important issue about knowing what your forage is and knowing what both your grass and your hay and haylages are. So it is worth getting that analysis done, because so many people come to us and we get people saying, oh, I need to provide another 10 milligrams of copper or something like that, because they've micro-analysed every feed that they're feeding, but they haven't got analysis from the grass, and the forage is always the largest part of the diet. So if you can, it's well worth getting both your grazing and your hays and haylages analysed.
Okay, fab. Jamie, it looks like you might have been reading the question that's come up. I don't know if you can see it, but question for Kate and Jamie. I have a mare who's been something opened for the third time, okay, and her progress has dramatically gone downhill post her second scope. All medications ceased, 4 weekly omeprazole injections, 2 tubs sucralfate. Would you recommend feeding GastroVet to her post her 4 omeprazole injections and sucralfate. Can you see that?
Why has she gone downhill? That's just what I'd be questioning. Obviously some kind of like Gastrofet would help, but
Sorry. There we go.
I'm just wondering why she's gotten worse. Is there another reason? Is there something underlying that is going on that the medication isn't working? I'd be a little bit worried about that. In that situation, keeping keeping a horse on omeprazole long term isn't good. I don't like doing that. But sucralfate's very, very good when you've got high gut ulceration, because it protects the mucosa, because it forms a barrier to protect from the acid erosion. But you don't want to keep a horse long term. You also kind of because 3 scopes and lots of treatment would be very, very expensive. You need to possibly look into why is your horse still having ulcers? Is there a reason for it? Is there something underlying that's going on? That's just what I'd be worried about in that situation. Is there some other reason?
Yeah, sure. I think it's an interesting point about keeping them on omeprazole. We had the first study a couple of years ago now showing that it was by the KER group, I think, showing that if you use omeprazole, it does reduce calcium absorption. And I know in the racing industry, they are quite concerned about the link of omeprazole and increased risk of fractures through sort of bone demineralization. So that's an area. And actually, Kate, you might want to comment. I think in humans, they're now looking very much at the use of omeprazole and the impact on the microbial population. Because you're changing the acidity in the stomach, it can allow more harmful bacteria through. And I think, is it C. difficile infections that they've been looking at specifically in human health as a result of the use of omeprazole? So I think there are repercussions for the digestive system, aren't there?
Yeah, I think we have to remember that sometimes we think that Mother Nature was having a bad day when she designed the horse's digestive system, but she designed it that way for a reason, and the acid is there for a reason, and the acid is doing a job, and if we it starts off the digestion, albeit in a small way in the stomach. So if we stop that acid, if we change the acidity, then it will have an impact on absorption and digestion. So all things in moderation. The omeprazole is a very useful way of getting on top of the issue, but you wouldn't want to use it long term, because you do risk upsetting that balance of both the microbiome and the gut-based immune system, the lymphoid tissue.
Jamie, are you sort of thinking there is that relationship between these sort of fractures and things with omeprazole? Is that something you're mindful of?
Yeah, no, definitely. I don't like long-term omeprazole treatment. I think it's more, it'll as Kate said, it cause more damage. It needs to be just a circuit breaker. That's what I see ulcer treatment as, a circuit breaker to get the pain from the stomach, to get the horse feeling a bit better, and then continue with aids, just so you can continue. But you only want to be treating as much as 3 months is the most I'd want to treat with omeprazole. Even 2 months of that is at a reduced rate.
Yeah. Can I ask, did you see the same level of incidence of ulcers when you were down under, and was it Australia or wherever?
I worked with thoroughbreds, so yeah, there's a lot of ulceration.
They have.
But actually, I worked in a stud in Australia in the Hunter Valley, and we had no ulceration in the foals because they were out 24/7.
Right.
The only problems we had was heat related, but it wasn't, and it was obviously irrigated. All farms there have to be irrigated because there's no rain. But it was really, really green and really well irrigated. But because animals were out constantly, you saw, that was one thing I saw, no incidents of ulceration. The foals and the mares were actually in good condition, and no incidents, and very, very few. But that was obviously a breeding scenario, so I wasn't working in a training scenario where there'd probably be more if they're housed more.
Yeah. That's interesting, thank you. I think that's all the questions. So unless anyone else pops one in very quickly, I just would like to say a huge thank you both to Kate and Jamie and Kat off camera. Thank you very much, and obviously to Redpost for sort facilitating this evening. It's been great, and thank you very much for your patience with my technological skills. Just a reminder, the goodie bags are there from the 5th, which is a week today. So after that, they should be available for you to collect. So yeah, I think all remains to say safe travels home in your own homes, and up the stairs to bed or whatever it might be. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you again soon, and I'm sure we can come up with some other interesting topics too.
And thank you to you, Katie, as well for organising it all. So it's much appreciated.
Oh no, you're welcome. Hopefully it hasn't been too painful.
Very informative.
Take care, everyone. Thank you very much again. Bye bye.
All right, thank you. Bye bye.